So introductions. My name's James Ernest. I run Crab Fragment Games, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny little indie website where you can print and play board games that I think are fun, but that I can't sell to publishers. So I used to run cheap-ass games. I no longer do. We can talk about that. And I have invented many, many games in my career, including dice games and card games and trading card games and board games and even casino games, even ones that are in real casinos right now, I think. So my background is mostly in tabletop. I've also done some digital game design. I've worked for Microsoft, which is a small game company, and other software company, as far as I understand, up in Redmond, Washington. You may, in fact, be running some of their software on your home computer right now. And I can answer some questions about the digital space, though definitely not as much.
Nice. Hi, I'm Robert Lacosse. I am a user experience strategist and architect. I build software for the most part and research people in order to build that software effectively. In the game space, let's see, I have designed and produced games for Intel Corporation, a small company not too far away from here. They make the chips that I've heard are not the delicious type, that go into these machines that the Microsoft company helps to run.
So as you can see, we're all one big, small, happy, unhappy family corporation.
Yeah. Let's see. So the games that I made for Intel were, among other things, often scalable architecture style. So it didn't matter if they played with 10 or 500. Some were cards, some were dice. A lot of them were toward a goal, as in, like, we want our sales reps to remember A, B, C, and D permanently. Or we want to analyze and potentially shift, or we want to analyze and shift the behavior of this organization because we have a feeling that they may be misbehaving in ways of sorts.
Permanently.
Yeah.
Does anyone have the description of this panel to hand, or can get it
Good
to hand?
Good question.
I do want to give the audience what they came for.
Yeah. Oh, and then of late, so I've been designing games with/for OMSI Museum of Science and Industry. I think this is the 8th or 9th year of engagement. So those are large, live-action, scalable puzzle/scavenger hunt style games. And now with the added bonus of 90% touchless.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah.
Fun design.
And as an industrial designer who's very oriented toward tactile artifacts, that was hard. That was real hard.
So the panel is what goes into getting a game designed, which is a strange way to phrase things, but so far I'm not surprised by that. What things have you not thought of, or what things have you thought of that don't matter? Come answer these questions with us. So yeah, it's just a straight up tabletop game design panel subject, open to questions. What would you like to hear about? One question can get me running for 30 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, so in playing games and designing games, is there certain mechanics that you found you never combine?
Uh-huh.
They're always terrible. And on the other side, what games have broken that rule and why?
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, I think the second part of that question is more interesting because there's plenty of rules of thumb for game design that everyone sort of swears by, but of course there are exceptions to all of those rules, very successful ones. And so generally speaking, I don't like to think of games in terms of mechanics first, that mechanics are like a toolbox.
I do.
Right, so he can answer differently than I will, but it's a box of tools, and the mechanics are really the easy part. Like, the experience you're trying to create is the hard part, and you can sell that through the story that's behind the game, or the framework of the game, or maybe sort of the structure of the game. But individual mechanics, like what size dice you're rolling and how many spaces you move, are so interchangeable as to be almost irrelevant to the overarching question of how to make a game. They're just tools in your box, and if you don't have those tools, you should make more games and play more games until you do. But I don't. I will say there is an answer to that that comes to mind, which is I did a game called Diceland, which had cardboard dice about yay big that you would fold together into these nice, sturdy little dice, and you would throw them into play. So targeting and accuracy were a factor. And then once they were in play, they moved around like miniatures. So they shot in directions and had strengths and guards and abilities and so forth. And that game had elements of miniatures games and elements of skill games or dexterity games, which therefore only appealed to those players who excelled at both, which is kind of a small group of players. Those few players loved that game, and I was one of those few players, and I supported that game long after I should have stopped. But, sunk cost fallacy. I'd paid for the cutting die, and I wanted to make more. So that's probably a mistake. You can look at it and say, well, it has these two aspects, and it therefore will appeal to the intersection of those groups. It's a bigger audience because it has these two factors that someone might like, but often it's really just the intersection of those groups. It's got to be someone who likes them both. And that's not the only two mechanics that are like that, but that's something to think about when you are doing something that's that weird of a hybrid is, am I growing my audience with this or am I shrinking it?
May I ruin a perception of fun?
Please.
Okay, so humans like consistency. You can reference Nielsen's heuristics. I'll send you it. Consistency makes for a good experience. When the player can approximately predict the majority of instances that are going to come about within a reasonable range. Now, let's talk about that reasonable range. So, when you go to make a game and you're trying to balance the game so it feels well built, so it feels good, basically, it all boils down more or less to a bell curve. So you could, I like the adoption curve. So for people who adopt something early, that's a certain percentage. Then you've got innovators, early adopters, the big middle, late adopters, laggards. Those percentage marks actually work really well for building games, because you can say that the vast majority of stuff in the middle should be balanced a certain way so as to create what you would expect to be a middle-powered card, or the most common card, right? If you're building a card game, so the great middle, and then you ask yourself, okay, so if that's the normative state in the middle, now you can experiment and figure out what should be on the X-Tense, what should be like a 5% count of your deck. So what should be a high power card? What should be a calamity or tragic event? And then you know how to balance those cards in context of what the norm in the middle is, and approximately how many instances of those wild outliers to put in the deck so it still feels right.
And I'll disagree with what you said, only insofar as that what you said was that I was going to disagree with you. Because I agree with you. When game designers talk about this, the way we say it is, that one way to envision fun is poking at a system, making predictions about what will happen, and usually, but not always, being right. So if you're never right, you are confused, and you don't know what to try next. And if you're always right, you're bored because you feel like you've seen everything. So that definition of fun is keeping someone on that sort of flow state or that middle ground of, I'm poking at this thing, I think it's going to do X, and usually it does, and I feel smart, and sometimes it doesn't, and I'm like, what else can I learn? That's what fun is, because that's what play is, because play is our gateway to learning, and we are hardwired to learn stuff. And when we get tired of a game, it's because we feel like...
Want to join us?
When we get tired of a game, it's because we feel like we've seen everything it can show us. I mean, that can happen before you play it the first time. You can look at a game and right away suspect
Come on down to the panel.
that it has nothing new to show you. You could be wrong about that, but if that's what you think, you're done with the game.
Two things that you said that I want to interject. Just to be clear, there is a book literally called The Theory of Fun. You should get it and you should read it. Also, Theory of Flow. That is not just a piece of wet spaghetti.
Oh no, that's funny. We're just talking about your book right now.
I just got you
Raph
a
Koster.
panelist.
Yeah.
I just got you a panelist.
That's cool. No, it's good. This is everyone say hi to Raph.
So, Andrew Mayer is going to join us. The theory of flow is a very well established theory, and it's basically where skill and ability exist as two graphed axes, and then you see in the middle where it's just enough challenge and the player has just enough skill. That's where flow happens. What does that mean? What does flow mean? It means you can supersede the normal human attention span that has diminishing returns after 30, 60, or God forbid, 90 minutes. You can jump that shark because in the state of flow, those numbers go out the window.
Yeah, and Koster's analysis has a lot more to do with video games, and so he's working in a space where the game can add challenge as the player gets better. Tabletop games can't exactly do that, and so a lot of them are constructed in a way that the challenge is sort of discovered by better players, but it isn't necessarily an impediment to the worst players. It's harder to do that. Like, blackjack is a good example only because everyone knows this, but basic strategy of blackjack is fairly easy to learn. Perfect strategy is incredibly hard, and it gets you this much better at the game, which means you're not going to beat everyone, but you are going to be this much better. And, you know, if blackjack was a video game, the levels would just get harder, and you would just keep getting gooder at hitting or splitting or whatever. But tabletop can't do that, yeah.
This is really helpful, because one thing, I'll come up with an idea for a game and kind of have the story I wanted to tell, but then I'm thinking, well, how do I find the mechanics to make sure it, you know, is actually a game where it's, you have a chance of winning, a chance of losing. So what are some ways of thinking about, okay, here's the story I want to tell, what type of mechanics are going to work well with that story?
I got a cheap cheat.
Okay.
Look for the verbs.
Verbs?
If the story has verbs, the hero did something, the villain did something. The verbs are quite literally the actions. The actions then can inform the mechanics that you should consider, and the interplay of verbs between antagonist and protagonist gives you a pretty formulaic way to approach, like basically pulling mechanics and architecture out of a. Hey, we got 2 for the price of 1 call. Yeah, see, I wasn't being rude.
Anyway.
James tolerates me.
I have an answer for that, too. It's going to sound... I'm sorry. So, I had this conversation a few weeks ago with some gamers who were like, the story is stupid, no game should have a story, and then they immediately told me how their favorite game worked in terms of its story, right? So, if you have a story that works, what you're really talking about is probably a system that you can model. So is there a real-life system that is already designed, that already works, and has these checks and balances sort of baked into it? I think of that all the time. I write a lot of economic games. So, like, there are known systems and known platforms that have a working, that it's going to be, could be the basis for your game. Like, do I need to draw a card that says, that tells me everything that just happened, or can I build the mechanics of, we just played Jacob Marley Esquire, or Young Jacob Marley, an hour ago, and in that game, you are lending money to people who pay you interest, and you get that money back. And that's a known system. And to boil it down to its basics, you put $10 in, and eventually you get $14 back. So that's how the game is set up. You buy a loan for $10, the bank puts another 4 onto it, and then over time, 1 coin at a time, or faster maybe, it bleeds back to you. And the abstractions are not exactly like the real world. People default on loans, and if they take longer, they should be paying more interest and so forth. But like, the core mechanic is already there. And that's true of a lot of real world systems. If your story suggests a mechanic and your players expect that, then they already know how to play the game or what to expect before they read the first page of the rule book. And that's a huge relief, right? Monopoly is popular because it doesn't take long to explain what you're supposed to do in that game. Right? I don't care how bad everyone thinks it is. It's great. I know it's great because kids want to play it. Every holiday, every niece and nephew wants to play Monopoly. So you can't tell me it's a bad game.
That's why I don't like children.
I'm sure it's mutual.
Although I would argue with Monopoly, it's because it's the best thing they've got.
No, they want to play it. It's not because
They don't want
it's
to
the
finish it, though, right, most of the time.
You don't finish Monopoly, you just play it.
Okay, fair enough.
That's literally a line from my friend's niece. He says that game takes too long, and she says you don't finish Monopoly, you just play it.
No,
So we are wrong about what we think that game should give us.
I think we're wrong about why people play games, especially at different ages.
Yeah, we
right?
definitely
Like,
are.
My kids never play any
Let's
games.
introduce our new panelists.
Okay, I'm Alex Flagg from Crafted Games. I make board games and role-playing games and stuff like that.
I'm Andrew Mayer. I've been designing games for 30 years, as of this week, and mostly video games and other stuff, but I've done board game stuff and other development. in the past. So that's my background.
My
Including-
career doesn't turn 30 till next year.
I started my first company in I know it was 30 years ago because I got to the job, my first job in the video game industry. I got there and nobody was there because they were at the
Because there was no such thing as video games.
Computer Games Developer Conference.
Okay.
So
right, okay.
so they were the whole office was like, oh, sorry, we forgot about you. and I was sitting
Hey,
there.
new guy, we're all at GDC.
Yeah, one person was in the office, thankfully, and so I sat and all the lights were out, so it was pretty interesting.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Getting paid to do nothing though.
But
That's pretty good.
It was CGDC back then because it was the Computer Game Developers Conference.
Your
So-
life was a sandbox?
And what? My life was a sandbox?
Sandbox.
So GDC used to be
CGDC.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Because there, it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
just.
oh no.
game,
There were
it was
back
a-
then. Games were just games.
Games, right.
Now games are called analog games. They're not an analog of anything. They're just games.
It's like when I had to stop searching for RPGs and I set to start searching for TTRPGs if I wanted.
Right.
Because if you look for RPGs, you get some crazy Japanese
A
thing.
completely
from,
different thing altogether.
1995,
Question
yeah.
back here.
Yeah, so a lot of games have a flat arc where it just feels the same all the way through. How do you build in an arc where it kind of escalates over time in a game?
Well,
Or at least
it's up to you to figure out how to do that, but it's good to remember that you might want to. Some games it's okay that they're flat all the way through, right? Hearts is the same all the way through. The rules don't change. But a lot of games have what designers sometimes call a mana curve. Basically, there's access to more and more power as the game unfolds, and each of those turns pushes the marble a little farther out of the bowl. If you could imagine a marble like sitting in a bowl, and at the beginning of the game you can push it a little bit, and to win you got to get the marble all the way out, and every turn you get to push a little harder. That's how mana curves work.
Yeah.
And eventually, on a single turn, you could push hard enough to knock that thing all the way out of the bowl. It's when you can do 40 points of damage on a single turn.
Yeah.
The reason that it's opened up to you piece by piece is so that you can do exactly what you described, which is give the game sort of a shape. It isn't just 40 points on turn one.
Yep.
But most of the games, I would say most of the games, but a lot of the games that do that also do this thing where, like, the end is coming, right? And so
Right.
just as you're getting that thing where you're feeling like you're on the bike and really riding, boom, the game is over.
Yeah,
right?
you put a clock on a game so that people don't screw around and make it take too long, right?
Yes, or mash the win button, just make everybody feel better.
Right,
So-
or get to that point where somebody's so far ahead that the whole game's just going to basically deconstruct itself because there's so many resources flowing in.
Right. As you get to the point in the game where it's clear that no one could ever catch up with the leader, it's time to stop.
Yeah.
I guess maybe what I was talking about isn't just like more and more powerful, but like it kind of evolves as the game progresses.
So you have an
Well,
example
again,
of-
I don't have a specific answer because I don't know your game. It's good to think about games in those terms, though. To first have some kind of expansion or increase in stakes, as it were, and also to have some sort of trend to conclusion, whether it's just a clock or some other mechanical way that the game can't go too long.
And you can also build that around like decision spaces. So like if you start out with like, a lot of times the area control game, right? There's some kind of, you have your starting space and you're trying to expand out onto a board, take spaces. Usually that first initial move is like, okay, I want to move here. This is obvious. There's something to go for. And so it gives people the notion of like how they're supposed to start expanding strategies, but then they go to a point where now the decisions become much more complex. In an engine builder that's making, like opening up new spaces on the board, or that'd be a worker placement game. Like open up new spaces on the board if somebody achieves something, like this blinder comes off. And there's new decision spaces and new options, or adding cards through an engine builder. Like as your engine you're building is becoming more complex, the decision space, and it gives a feeling of a cascade, even if the game or that you're moving in some sort of arc, because you're slowly honing in on a way to win.
Right, and taking the games we played last night, what was the game with the dress game?
Rococo.
Right, so it's like you're getting more and more powerful, you're getting a hand of cards, you're getting more guys, but the ability to play and use those resources is getting tighter and tighter.
Yeah, you get
because you're
shorter
playing
time.
into a tableau of the dresses that you're building, and those spaces have value depending on how you place the dresses that you built there, and so you get better and better at building them. But now everybody's taking those spaces, and now you're finding yourself in conflict with that player more and more and more. And that's a pretty common way of dealing with things in Euros. Like, hey, you've got all the money to buy all the resources you want, except the resources are all sold out. So
Yeah, I guess. So I know you're gesturing this as like kind of like a curve, slowly escalating curve. And some games go and then you straight up. They'll have a cascade where all of a sudden, it's like an ice shelf shearing off a glacier. A bunch of things happen. There's all these catastrophic elements that change the environment and happen. So the cascade in anachrony is when the asteroid hits the Earth, and then all of a sudden this top board flips, and now the goal is escape the planet with as many people in your escape plan as you can, right? So that's, but you see, I think you can do it by like expanding space, engine builders, stuff like that, or by contracting space. So that's, I think actually area control games are good about contracted space, even though you feel they're expansive. The available spaces, the things you're competing, you're naturally getting closer and closer to each other, and competition's getting tighter and tighter. Gives a feeling of a natural arc as you're moving to some sort of conclusion or winning condition.
Is that the kind of thing you were looking for? Is it?
Yeah, I think so.
I think this also bears mention per Jordy and per your prompts. Let me ruin stories. So, BT dubs, there are 6 shapes and stories. Kurt Vonnegut created a thesis. It was rejected by University of Columbia, Chicago, in which he said, yeah, I think there's a shape to stories. Turns out that's 100% true. Because now that we have artificial intelligence and Project Gutenberg, basically, we took 30,000 classical stories, ran them through an AI, and the AI was like, here's the shapes of stories. There are 6. You should definitely look into those, because those can help enrich the thinking around like what type of shape of story do you want it to be, and you'll have examples of stories in that shape that you can draw.
One last thing, so I'm talking about shapes, and made me think about that. Like the curve gesture, I think is really useful, because that's telling you have an end, or you have a beginning, you have an end, right? So you start one end and you end up on another end. And that's the winner, is that person there. But again, shapes of games, and what that curve looks like can be circular. It's getting small. It's the contracting. The notion of, you can visualize that this is not a line. It doesn't start at A and goes to B. Sometimes it comes all the way around to itself. Sometimes it just keeps getting bigger forever, and eventually things peter out. But like games, the stories that are told by what we're doing, the rituals we're going through to play a board game, can be very different than just a 3-act narrative. Sorry, maybe that's a little.
I think
No, totally.
it's mechanically the notion of growing your power base and shrinking the size of the world are kind of the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? As the world shrinks, your power base grows in proportion to it. So whether you're running out of places to play things, or whether you're being able to play bigger and bigger expansion every turn, that's kind of just 2 ways to do the same thing.
Yeah. I think there's like your power base gets bigger, but then the competition for resources gets tighter, and then the area shrinks, and that leads to greater conflict, right? So it's a vacuum of pulling things together.
Just on that, one that I had is, so you've got the traditional antagonistic games, but I've seen a rise in cooperative games, and I've struggled with how do you make a game cooperative? Because it's easy for me to think, oh, you fight this person, you steal that, but cooperative is like, okay, without having a GM to run the villain, how do you have something that all the players are working towards but not?
Oh, you build an AI. That's basically how a co-op game could also be thought of as a single-player game, where you're playing against an algorithm. And that algorithm could be generating random cards, or could be a totally scripted story, or anything in between, but you have to work together with what is presumably divided resources to overcome the challenge, which is probably time-based or some other, game. But you think of it more, I think, in terms of a one-player game before you split it out into the multiple players, and then that co-op game makes sense. Everything we think is new in the game industry, D&D did it first. RPGs are co-op games. And clearly there is also a GM, but most of the party is trying to get a thing done, right? Hey, games where you don't buy all the components, you just get a book and buy your own dice. Oh yeah, D&D did that. Games where they make all their money on expansions. Oh yeah, D&D did that. Like, everything came out of D&D, and it was getting parsed up into new fads every 10 years. How do you make a co-op game? I've made half of one.
Yeah, so co-ops are hard. I like competition. I like interaction of players, but I think interaction is just as important in a co-op game. The framing device we use when making an NPC is, who are they, what do they want, why can't they have it? Why can't they have it is the question you're asking for a co-op game, I think, because why don't the players just automatically win? Why don't they just cheat? Why do they stay in it? So it's what keeps them hooked. Why do they want to play? Why do they go through that activity? But the other thing is like what prevents them from working in perfect unison all the time. It makes it feel like a game of where we both have a different level of understanding of what we're trying to do, how we're trying to get there, what sort of information do we have relative to each other. So like I'm looking at licensing a game right now that's a co-op war game that I saw is brilliant, and it involves blind simultaneous play. And if you play simultaneously, you get like a super bonus, right? So it's like feels good to be in sync, and you have to do that repeatedly. But that also plays down your hand for use in this thing. I've never seen a co-op war game before that really works without an AI, because it all is coming out of like what you're trying to do. So usually you're making all the taking all the initiative, but I think the thing is, I don't know what the other player has in their hand. I don't know what they're going to play at any moment. We can kind of cook that using some resources, but ultimately, like that tension is just delicious. It makes the game really interesting and challenging. And then there's a bunch of just hard fail conditions. It's also just freaking hard. So. If you have those things, I think that's probably enough. Like you're creating an enjoyable activity that people could, if they don't like it, they could just cheat their way away. So it really is like they're there for each other, and they're there to feel like they don't have perfect information, and this is worth like an intriguing activity to stay with. So also keep it short. Don't make it to a co-op game goes forever.
So Sentinels of the Multiverse has a mechanic where if you die, you're still kind of in the game. You flip your card over and now you have every turn you can do this to help your people.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like other examples of ways like elimination actually works for the game? Because elimination I feel usually isn't kind of
Yeah, I think a cardinal rule of design is you don't want to eliminate players before the game is over. Games that break that rule last under 90 seconds, and so it's okay. But what you're talking about in Sentinels really isn't player elimination. It's converting them to a different type of player. So that's why it's working, because it's not really taking them out. I think it's just one of the many things to be mindful of. You don't want, Monopoly is bad for this reason. You don't want to knock somebody out and have them have to go make a sandwich and wait 30 minutes, 2 hours,
That's
or
why
whatever.
nobody ever finishes Monopoly.
You
Right.
want to extend their torture.
Well,
Extend it.
Well, right, and
It's
that's the other
permanent.
thing, too. You have to be careful not to hang a player out with something where the condition is that they can't win, but they're just hanging around.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
an
the
even
kneecapping
worse
is
case
the
is being a
worst.
hostage of the game. Like, you
Yeah.
can't win, but you're still playing. That is worse than being
Right, and then
eliminated.
people turn into kingmakers and things get all
Yeah.
right, because no system can handle a player like almost no game can handle a player intentionally trying to convert an outcome at the cost of their own success, right? Like, because if the players aren't gathering resources and doing stuff the way they need to do it,
There are games that survive that kind of torpedo.
I'm sure there are, but they're not the majority. I've seen a lot of games.
Poker.
Oh yeah.
A single player can't torpedo anyone but himself.
Right, because you're
Well,
not-
yeah, but when we talk about gambling games, I think the incentives are all completely changed and stuff like that. So, that I'm not going to put into the same category. Like, I don't put gambling games and games for entertainment into the same category because of the incentives being different. Like, the guy who taught me, Rob Phillip was the guy who taught me game design, right? He had been a professional poker player before he'd ever gotten into.
Yeah, but I don't think this is a question of incentives. We're saying, is there a structure? And I only mention poker because everyone knows it, right? But is there a structure that's insulated from one player screwing up and making everyone else's lives bad, right? There are probably plenty of examples in the tabletop.
No,
game space.
choosing who to win. Like, that's what I'm saying.
So you
Right.
can transfer all my wins.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Let me just finish the example I was going to give. We were talking about backgammon, right? Play backgammon. Have everybody pretty much played backgammon? People like backgammon. Have you played it with a doubling die?
Yeah.
Have you played it with doubling die with cash?
Yeah.
So I feel like my visit is like backgammon with cash and a doubling die is a very different game than sitting around the table and playing backgammon without. And like that's where I really that was my basis for understanding the incentives and understanding the difference between a game that has if you want something that purely and quickly is going to show you the difference in incentives from gambling and not gambling and look, to go to your point about the thing, like in the way the doubling die works in backgammon, right, is that let's say you're playing for a quarter, the dice is 2, 4, it's doubling every time, right? 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and that number represents the X times the original stake, right? So 1 quarter, not a big deal. 2 quarters, not a big deal, right? 64 quarters, fairly big. And every time somebody turns over the doubling die, the other player has the opportunity to concede the game. right? And so that's exactly what we're talking, like, and that's like that a pressure to finish. We are done. We have come in. There's
But
some
the-
money standing.
The topic on the table is king making. There's no such thing in a two-player game.
No, I didn't say king making. I was talking about the incentives to when you're in a condition of failure in the game state. To what the opportunity, why you have to have a valve for players to be able to get out of that effectively. So that's really what I'm talking about. King making is you didn't put that valve in there correctly, and here's a way that the game is starting to twist and go wrong, because as a designer you didn't put in the proper outputs or handle that situation elegantly. Is my opinion, but that's how I see that
I
working.
think player elimination is fine in two-player games because that usually ends the game.
Right.
Everywhere
Player
else,
elimination is defined as before the end of the game. If it's a two-player game and you eliminate player one, player two
Exactly.
wins and it's
So,
over.
That's
I
why you
hope.
find the dueling games are always like just knock each other out. 'Cause it's the
Wait a
end of the
minute.
game.
Now I want to make that game where if you win, you have to keep playing. It's chess, but after the other king is dead, you have to rule the kingdom.
Oh, man.
It's called Ghost of a Chance.
I think Dice of Crowns kind of works like that.
I don't know that game.
First
How does it
person to
work?
get X amount of crowns takes the crown, basically the winning piece, but they have to hold on to it for an entire round before they actually win.
Sure. So they haven't won yet, or been eliminated.
Yeah.
They've effectively won.
Well, a good example is like,
So it's one round of everyone else being very sad that they can't do anything.
Pretty much.
yeah, because you
Shame
have
I
like,
haven't heard of this
if
game.
you've ever played Root, and the ending condition of it is like hold two of these grows, bunnies or foxes or whatever, but you have one round where everybody can attack you, and all you gotta do is take one of those away. Or you have to own three, so it's difficult. But it's the way to win without skip the points, and so that's another way you can handle king making is people or let people turn their code, become a different state. They shift their own state by changing their victory conditions.
Yeah,
Don't
if-
let them shortcut.
If Dave Hall was here, he would tell you one of his
Golden guidelines.
maxim golden guidelines of game design is that game is only fun as long as a player feels like they have a reasonable chance to win, and that reasonable chance doesn't have to be 100%. In fact, it's not fun. It has to be reasonable, and if it's below a certain threshold, if you're trapped in a game and feel like you can't win, that's when you start sabotaging it and screwing it up for everyone else.
Yeah.
That's how crime works. As long as you feel like you have a reasonable chance, you will stay on and then keep playing. And so bear that in mind as you're designing your systems, not to artificially keep people together, but to understand if they're flying apart, why, and what to do about it.
And that's why even in a game like they'll let you shoot the moon. Like there's it's so you're saying there's a chance, right?
So you're saying there's a chance.
Right. So but that is if you can pull that off, that is like people always remember those. So there's a reason you can have the uneven key making, where people can fall back as long as they have this valve, even if it looks maybe highly improbable and not impossible, they will, because that is the juice. That's a story you can tell your buddies.
Nobody forgets when the Bene Gesserit wins in Dune, right?
No one forgets.
Yeah.
No one also forgets. I do not forget.
Right? You always
Steal
remember
my
that.
victory.
No one forgives is a different story.
No one forgives
This is
anybody in
Dune
a
we're
game of
talking about
Dune.
Speaking of a game with a catch-up problem, you lose one fight, and it's like, you're out for 2 hours, but you have to stay.
Game wouldn't be the same without
Yeah,
you.
never ally Harkonnen to friend.
I was playing one of my games at a game convention once, and a friend came over and watched us play for like 15 minutes. And she said, "It seems like this game has a lot of downtime." And I'm like, "Well, I guess, do you want to join us?" She says, "No, I'm in a game of Titan right now."
Which brings up the question: how do you kill downtime between turns? Like, how do you make sure people are engaged?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of ways that can happen, and so there's a lot of ways to solve it, right? Downtime is basically you're watching the game happen, but you're not making any decisions. It's not your turn, and by the time it is your turn, things are going to have changed so much that it's not worth thinking about it right now. That's kind of like what downtime feels like, right? It depends on the kind of game it is, because the game we were playing actually was mostly a game where we sit around and joke about what's going on, and so the downtime is uptime. We're having fun, right? But that doesn't appeal to everyone, and so one way to do it is to take your very complicated turn and split it up into lots of smaller turns. Because if I get to do just one phase instead of all 6, and then it's the next guy's turn, then at least we're going faster, and at least I'm doing a little processing before it comes around to me again. Carcassonne actually takes less time with more players if you draw ahead, because everyone can be thinking about what they're going to play, and the board doesn't change too much to do that. So it actually slows down. It just depends on how you present it, but that's because the steps in Carcassonne are so simple. So if you can break your turn down into smaller chunks and let the turn marker move faster, that's one way to keep the downtime from being annoying. Don't rate it for 6. That's a good idea too. Like, tell people that they are asking for trouble if they play a turn-based game with 6, or find out a way to make it simultaneous, or make some parts of it simultaneous.
Yeah, you can break into subphases. So like if you have a game that's like involves card play, like any sort of action selection, I'm gonna play this, do this, take a spot, whatever. Like just have them do one at a time and then move. Like so everybody's making a series of small discrete decisions which add up to a larger strategy over the course of the turn that they can build as things change. But that change feels more incremental because they're only seeing, X minus 1 number of player actions, which minus their own, right? And so they're seeing the board change, but they can constantly react and see, okay, I don't have to decide. This whole thing hasn't just disappeared. Maybe the spot I wanted is gone, but I have got another one.
So games for big groups work well if your turn is incredibly fast. Poker, hearts, bam, 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 you take your turn. But I don't mean just breaking the turn down. Oh, that's good. Simultaneous means everyone's doing literally the same thing at the same time.
Or make the action of the other players, make the other players involved in your turn. So like the big, so Reiner's solution, what turned me on to him early on in the 90s was, it's an auction, right? I'm holding the auction. Okay, well everybody's got to pay attention to me, and everybody's getting the value in what I'm doing, right? So that's always good. Throw an auction in. Anything was Container that we played, right? Had a lot of that where I'm watching like. The other player's turn is either selling stuff that I'm sure there's some stuff in there. It's either selling stuff that I'm interested in an auction I'm in, or it's buying something and I hope that they're buying it from me, right? So I'm holding the resources of the other. So there's a lot of that kind of interaction where it's happening. The turn itself is interaction with other players or resources that the other players are holding.
Your off time is watching the board state change, and so you feel engaged even though you're not actually.
Right. Well, if they're giving you money, and you're hoping that they're going to give you money, right?
Yeah.
So that's nice too. So yeah, there's ways around that just by involving the other players in decision making. That's happening on the turn.
I think there's a lot of value in viewing a game, the course of play, as a theatrical production play. 3-act structure: intro, rising tension, resolution. Multiple characters on stage at the same time, spotlight shifts from one to the other, but the other characters on stage still impact whoever has the spotlight at the time. They don't go off stage. In a game, you don't have a solo or a monologue. Well, unless it's solitaire, in which it's all monologue. Let's see. And framing this in a large context, it's about balancing the intra-play, as in it is my turn, I am focused on my world, versus interplay, which is I pay attention to what the other players are doing to enable me to engage in an intra-play more effectively. Yes. Huzzah!
So one of the things that I tend to wrestle with a lot is coming up with just interesting, end goals or like actions that you can do with certain cards. Like, so it ends up being just very sort of boring, kind of like trade 1 resource for 2 resources, or so like. What kinds of methods do you guys use when you're trying to come up with sort of more interesting stuff? And when you play in a game and you see that happen, it's like, this card is awesome and everybody wants that
I always
card.
go back to the story. What's the theme of the game? What's the story? What am I trying to tell? Which is why I'm kind of lost if I don't start with that.
Right.
But how do I win is often clear in the story if I'm telling it right, and what individual cards do. People don't think this, but Magic the Gathering is extremely story-based on a micro level. Every individual card tells you what it does through its title and its theme. And you can remember what it does through that title and that art and that theme. On a macro level, the story is kind of irrelevant, but on the card level, the story is huge. If I say Lightning Bolt, you have a pretty good expectation of what that's going to do. If I call that card Steve, I don't know what this does, right?
Oh, I know what Steve does.
Eventually people learn what Steve does, but you get what I'm saying. So that's my answer, is what is the story on a card level and a whole game level too.
my thinking is always, what is it that you could do that would break the game, and then do it, and then crawl your way back, right? so that it doesn't, right? Because the interesting ideas for stuff like cards are going to be things that, the reason that card is cool is why. Most of the time it's because it's twisting your expectation of what you thought was possible within the context of the game. So that's either by adding a rule that breaks the basic rules, right, which is one way to do it, or this is sort of like I call it the Mario style. I can explain why I call it that, but show that the player that there's a trick that's possible that they didn't understand, that something the system can do, right? You thought it could only roll over, but it can also sit up, and it can also shake do a shake, right? Like, and that's really good. And the reason I call it the Mario thing is because if you look at like the early Mario games, it's always like give the player some basics and then push them to do things with that ability that they didn't know was possible.
Yeah, I think a version of that is to say, the game lets me do X and Y and Z, but I would never do Z because clearly it's bad.
Right.
Okay. Create the circumstance in which doing Z is the right thing to do. That might be a whole different avenue of gameplay. Like Magic cards do that all the time.
And
I'm going to play this game upside down, and
this,
here's
yeah.
why.
I think of Blood Rage, like every time I think of those kinds of mechanics, it's Blood Rage always comes to my mind because, one of the best ways to win is to kill all your people. Like it just inverts that whole sort of
Glorious
narrative.
battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Low-key strategy is
Yeah.
brutal.
Yeah. So I would say this with designing, like if you're trying to design, I do this all the time. I frame up a game when it's in development. I'll frame up a game, figure out what its core is, really try to work on that, hone that as much as I can, right? But then you're shackled to like the balance, like how does this all work? And then you can't really break away. Yeah, exactly. You're in the spreadsheet. And so I have two things that I remind myself of when I'm in those situations. Like, one is to remind myself what do people want? Like, so the question is like, what will make people feel good? Because we play games to have fun. And having fun is doing something cool, right? And doing something nobody else can do, that's also cool, right? And so I'll say like, why do people play RPG? They want to be a badass. They want to be a spy. They want to be a fighter. They want to be, I don't know, whatever.
Wizard or whatever.
Cotton-headed ninny muggins, whatever they want to be called. But that's what they
Yes.
want to do.
Level 3.
They want to do that thing, and so like, you give that to them. Like, so find a way that, instead of saying like, how is this fair? Stop saying how is it fair, and how is it fun, and follow the Dave Williams rule, of which is every game is a little bit broken.
Right.
Like, you want to push that
Yeah,
all the
well.
way to the edge. Dave Williams was the developer of almost all of AEG's, CCG's back in the day.
He was a Magic player, right?
Yeah.
Came
and
up
then-
through Magic, developed CCGs, became a poker player, right?
Probably, I don't
think
know.
so,
He
yeah.
made a lot of money doing it, so
Yeah.
he's out of my strata. But the whole point is like Williams had to understand that like the cards should be kind of broken, because like he was writing a living, like he was developing when he's doing like L5R, they were telling a story all the time. So they constantly break the game a little bit, because you wanted players to find that and find that little thing and then exploit it, and they're smart. They make them feel smart. Make them feel smart. That's also fun. Makes you feel like a badass. Go back to it. Why do people play games, right? So you just give them what they want. Like let them have fun. And if some of those things are very uneven that you come up with, rate them so that they draw later in the
Or have,
day.
less
Make
fewer
them more
cards
expensive.
position
Yeah, there's
them.
totally things you can do about it. You can handle the balance, but like, why are people doing it? That's what playtesting's for. So James has his stories, and then you find out what people really love about those things when you're doing the playtesting part.
I think.
But don't give them too much of it. Scarcity must be maintained in order for it to be a commodified feeling. Because if you overload that feeling, then it becomes worthless.
This is why I make my children sleep in a cardboard box.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
Cardboard box.
Oh, you wanted flavored food? It's not Tuesday.
So they'll tell
No
you.
salt this week.
They'll tell you, and we will all tell you, to write the game that you want to play, which is half of the right advice. But there's two U's in that. Don't write the game that the game designer, wants to play. Write the game that your inner child wants to play. Understand why you really play games, what really is fun about them. So the first time I played C23/Arc System/Xena, I don't remember which one it was, but it was a sort of a beginner trading wheels CCG that came out from Wizards in the early noughties. And the first time I played it as a game designer. I was like, every one of these cards is broken. These are all easy ways to win. This is just a badly made game. But I came back to it the next week and I looked at the same deck as if I was a player, I was just in a different mood that day, and I was like, hey, this game is great. Every one of these cards is broken, and there's an easy way to win with every one of these. Like, you just have to be able to look at it from the perspective of the player who really wants to play, or feel smart, or break the game, or whatever, and not try to make a game that's strictly for the game designer in you, because that's not your audience.
It was interesting. So LucasArts in its late days, they were doing the Force Unleashed video game, right? And so you played the old Star Wars game. So anybody who played the old Star Wars RPG, you can't be a Jedi. Only Luke Skywalker can be a Jedi. You get to be a schmuck.
Everybody gets to be a
Right?
Jedi.
I hate every game. I hate any game that says like, oh, there's a feat you only get if your last name is Skywalker, or whatever stupid thing they have. Like, oh, look, it's Lord of the Rings, but the Fellowship's over here winning the world, and you're just
Pruning. You're
orc
pruning the
number
bushes at the Red
387,
Dragon Inn.
standing in the back line, you know, whatever. You never see anything. You never do anything cool. Like, that's not fun, right? And I lost my thought.
LucasArts. Game designers. LucasArts.
So that's right. At the beginning of these meetings, this version of Star Wars, they had a meeting every morning, and they could sit down and they say, "Why are we making this? Or what is this game about?" And then everybody would shout, "Using the Force to kick ass," because that game is insane. You're ripping ships apart with using the Force. You're grabbing dozens of guys and flaming them up to these stratospheric levels, and you feel so cool doing it. There's nothing wrong with giving people that. I think it's, as long as it's fair, if other people do the same thing in a competitive game, great.
As long as it doesn't get boring, as long as it keeps generating novelty.
Sure.
Because that's the other thing about really cool cards, right? Is that once you like going back to a game that's really tight, and I'd have to think for a minute to come up with one, like a card game that you love. It's like you play the game, you learn the game, and there's all these cards that when you first played it, you don't even know why the hell they're in there.
Yeah.
And then 6 games later, you're like, this card is the key to everything. It's the genius move, right? Because you've discovered the game keeps unlocking novelty, because as you understand the mechanics, you understand new ways to play and new things to do and things that you've never. Well, Res Arcana is a really good example of a game like that.
Seasons is another one.
So another lens that you could apply the bell curve to is strategy. You should have your obvious strategies, a lot of obvious strategies, and then there are your outliers, ones that convert a bad move into a good move, and ones that are just insanely complex by stringing together a number of middle strategies.
I did want to say I've seen a trap that a lot of designers fall into, because they forget one small thing is that, you can tweak it, you can try to make it better, you can try to make it fit. If it's just not working, it's okay to trim the fat.
Drown your kittens is a
Yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
dude, the mark of a good designer is being willing to dash your baby upon the rocks in the event that it turns out it has an ugly baby.
Because you can make more babies.
Indeed, you can.
It only takes several months.
I mean, the hard part is, though, with that, right? And the lesson is you have to kind of learn over and over again is you were inspired by an idea that you thought was cool, and your instinct as a designer, especially as you go along and get better, is if I have that instinct that there's a there there, well, this is how I design anyway. I believe there's a there there. I trust myself to that degree, and to go down that path and to admit that there is no there there every so often, that can be hard, because it undermines your own confidence and your ability to trust yourself that these avenues are worth going down. And and I had idea, especially in video game stuff, it's like, this is a great idea, it should be doable. You are in no position to have the resources necessary to create the idea that, there's no, for a while it was like the technology doesn't exist, right? Like, oh, I want a weather system in my game. Yeah, you're not emulating weather, get out of here. And stuff like that, right? So it's possible what you've dreamed, but maybe you're not in the position to make that happen, or maybe it just needs to go into that pile of good ideas, and you'll get back to it and discover that there is a there, but you're just not right now. A lot of stuff like
Sometimes
that.
you're not ready to make the game that you have an idea for, so your reach exceeds your grasp,
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Or it just keeps, it turns out to get to that feeling that you were looking for in play, it's just too far down the road. The question is, when do you stop, right? Because I've been accused many times of stopping way too early, or like hitting a wall and not finishing stuff and just throwing it on the pile, and admittedly, and I've also learned about myself for the years, that beginning part of the exploration is my favorite part, before you get to that really hard curve where it's like, yep, you got to finish dancing with this thing until it's out there. So,
I think there's really two levels on which you can murder a darling, though. Like, if you have a game experience, if you have a story or a theme or a character or whatever is really at the heart of the game you want to make, I don't think you need to feel like you walk away from that. I think the darling that gets murdered is when you build a mechanic or a mechanism, or if you build a game that you try that clearly isn't working. You don't throw away everything. You throw away that execution. You don't get attached to any particular execution, because the reason it's failing is because the idea you were trying to convey, the story you were trying to tell, isn't coming through that. You murder the mechanism. That should be easy. You should get really good at that. But don't mean that doesn't mean you have to throw away the idea. It doesn't mean the idea can't be done. It just means you need to try again.
Sure. I think, but it's understanding what your game is about, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, some games are more about theme. We were literally talking about this downstairs after the TTRPG. Now I'm saying TTRPG. The role-playing game demo we did downstairs, analog. So that, I was like, the mechanics can be anything. It's executing on the theme. Like, you have to constantly, like, that's the primacy, right? But then in board games, it'll be different. Like, a draw Euro is about the mechanical execution. It's like watching this little Swiss clock. And the cuckoo comes out, goes around, and then a chip falls down, and blink makes some noises, whatever. That's certain games. So it's kind of understanding why your audience is playing it, what they want, right? And I think you can suss that out, but also you got to figure out what's prime, and then everything else you can be slicing off, because you want to take it down to the nub, I think, usually.
Oh, that's before you have your game legs, before you're like, yes, I know how to make a game, just drive to it. If you really want to make a game, I would challenge you to make it 3 different ways, or 5 different ways, and then you'll have, and do it quickly. Don't even worry, just crank it out.
Sure.
Because the idea is to just build that muscle memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, working for too long on a single idea is what makes it hard to kill.
Yes.
And if you come out of another discipline like writing fiction, you're used to doing a lot of work before you show it to anybody. If you do that in games, you've done too much.
Yeah. Love makes you weak.
Well, more wasted time.
Yeah.
Wasted time.
Yeah, your first plan will not survive first contact with the enemy, and the problem with games is that people have to really participate to play your game. It's not as easy as reading a book or watching a movie. They literally have to do the thing. So if they're not able or willing to do that thing, you need to change that thing.
I saw a hand from the back that's been, right, I know.
Briefly said playtesting. What are some questions you would ask playtesters? Because that's my concern is when I get to the point where I've got stuff together and I bring it here or somewhere else to have people play it outside my family. What kind of questions do you ask? Have people really tell you the truth? And
They will never really tell you the truth.
I know, I know they're not going to.
Because they don't know how, right? Because they don't know how to express that in those terms.
So how do you cook that out of them?
Right.
I want to recommend a tool. It's already out there. It's from Jay Cormier, who does. He did mind management recently. He's been a game designer for 17 years. He did a thing called the Fail Faster Journal.
Sorry.
Slow down a little.
Okay. From Jay Cormier, who did the mind management thing, did a thing called the Fail Faster Journal. It's a workbook. You can buy it physically, I believe, but maybe it's only in Canada. And you can also, I've got an electronic version of it. So Fail Faster is designed to help you guide through playtesting process. It includes questions to ask, reminders. It can be used as a little tracker, and you can, use it to randomize numbers and stuff if you have to pull stuff out. But I think the questions part is one of the best things, because it helps you over the course of 20 play tests. It helps you frame the questions you might want to ask at a time. Because I think, did you like it is not a useful
No.
right? So because that's not really what you need to know. You can figure that out. You figure out what was working and why didn't you.
What didn't work or what?
Well, an opinion question. There's a lot of people want to try to redesign your game. When you ask them, solicit them for anything, they're let me tell you about I have a master's degree in mathematics and this is incorrect. So I think observation, I like observation best. So I like just watching and listening and not saying anything. Other than perhaps.
Occasionally click the pen, write something cryptic in the notebook.
Yeah.
Proceed.
Yes, but that's not. You're not purely disengaged. I will show people how it works. I will tell them the order of operations and how they get started so they feel like they can stand up. and then I may let them go. Because I think you'll watch, and it's watching people know what they're doing. You don't care about what movie they took unless they say, how does this card work? That you care about that. But you really are watching their faces. When are they excited? When are they frustrated? And then you want to observe what they're doing. So I think they will just listen to them and let the conversation roll, let them grouse. These are all be things, but I think it's not so much about asking questions as just drawing passive information out of them.
How about this?
Without looking creepy.
This is how about this? This is the majority of what I do for my day job. It's user research. If you want a giant area to explore, the phrase you're looking for is usability testing. Usability testing and user research are giant areas to explore, and it goes from everywhere from early fuzzy front end, like what idea would people be interested in and what needs are currently unserved, all the way to I have an idea for a product and I want to fail fast and do iterative design and cycle through bad and good ideas quickly, to I think I have a pre-launch product, so now it's time to do a non-moderated, unstructured playtest and simply be a fly on the wall, or not even be in the room but have recording equipment in the room.
That's the blind test.
But I will say there are, so there was a period between where the world where Rob lives in now and the world of purely like city and focus testing, which was online stuff and like getting massive numbers of online feedback and processing that. And the tricks from that, which I think are useful, are don't ask like, what was the thing you liked the least about this game experience? And then hit them with what is it you liked the most about it. So you get them into a place where people are giving you feedback as objectively as possible. It's never, because people are always going to give you subjective experience. They're always going to tell you about what they, how they liked it and what all that stuff is. And if you can, so have a list of questions and go into, and I'd say the more you go into a play test with, and it's not always possible, with what you're looking to get out of that play test, the more you can form those questions. And as everybody else is saying, the stuff that you didn't intend to get out of it, you're going to get out of it for free anyway, right? So pick a few targets, some things you want to fix, ask some detailed, go in with those questions, and that'll help you, I think. And then always listen to what they're telling you and try to pull out the truth out of what out of the way they're saying it. Because they can say, I really, really like this because it gives me everything all the time. And it's like, you like that because it happened to you here, but that's not, what you're telling me is there's a part of this game where it's giving you way too much.
I've got one phrase, and if you're going to write down any phrase out of my mouth, it's this.
Oh, God.
Tell me more.
It
gives me everything I want. Tell me more.
I'll give you another phrase.
Oh, it gives me all the mana I want. Tell me more.
Oh, look at yeah, and that's great. That's great. I think another one that I took for my usability time is called "Don't Make Me Think."
Yes.
So this is my introduction. I think it's everybody's introduction to usability, and it's useful for lots and lots and lots of things beyond web stuff. It's a simple treatise about telling people what usability is, and the whole rule is don't make me think. And when you think about this, what does this icon mean? Don't make me think. They should know. They should look and know. Like that's the target you're always shooting for, right? Is that you don't want them to. Like, it's felt like this.
I have an answer to this question too, but we are out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yours is more interesting than mine, I'm sure.
You'll never know because we're moving on to our next event, which I'm also at. Is any of you also at it?
What is the next event?
I wasn't even
How
at
to
this
teach
one.
a game. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.